record. And now I'm going to share my screen. Yeah, so let's get to now. So let's get onto our Sakai platform. We're in group 11. We'll go straight to our schedule of work for the semester, which we just finished in our last class. So this is a summary of what we've done. We just go through them again. But before that, I need to keep this phone away from me. You know, these phones, they radiate a lot of energy. The batteries are made of uranium. So let me keep it at an arm's length. I'll just keep it across the room. Okay, so I'm back. When we started the semester, we introduced the course by discussing types of sentence-shaped thoughts. We saw interrogatives, imperatives, and all those things. We said interrogatives are sentences spoken to solicit information. Imperatives are sentences spoken to get someone to do something. Then the declaratives are those sentences spoken to convey information. And we said there are 4 types. We have factual statements, value judgments, definitions, and arguments. The factual statements are those statements about the external world. And then the definitions are sentences spoken to provide information about meaning. And we saw the value judgments, which are statements about something's moral, practical, or aesthetic value, or suitability. We saw 2 types of value judgments. We saw the moral, non-moral. We saw emotive expressions. We saw sentence fragments. And that was basically what we did for our first class. And then in our second class, we went to definitions. Definitions, let me see if I have definitions here. So definitions and their problems. So we saw, like we said, definitions are sentences spoken to convey information about the meaning of something. And we saw the 2 parts of the sentence in a definition. We saw the definiendum and definiens. We said the definiendum is like the subject. The definiens is like the predicate. Definiendum is what is being defined, and then definiens is what is doing the defining. From there, we saw types of definitions. We saw lexical definitions, the dictionary ones. We saw ostensive definitions, definitions that can only be done by physical demonstration, but cannot be done by words, Then we saw the theoretical definitions, definitions originating from specific academic disciplines. We saw stipulative definitions, those kinds of definitions that we formulate at our own time for our own purposes. We saw operational definitions, those definitions that outline a certain procedure or operation. And then we saw the essential definitions. We said these are the only definitions we call the real definitions, because they are the only definitions that are completely accurate. From there, we discussed problems with definitions. We saw that definitions could come with different problems. The first problem we saw was that definitions could be too broad if the definition is referring to items that are more than is required to define the definiendum. But definitions could be too narrow if the definition refers to items that are not enough to define the definiendum. And definitions could be vague if there's no way of telling what class of things the definition refers to. And then definitions could be ambiguous if they present you with more than one meaning of the definiendum. Then we saw secularity. Definitions could be secular if the definition is repeating the definiendum. Morality is to be morally right. Definitions beg the question if the definition is obscure or digresses from providing meaning or does not even help in shedding meaning on the definiendum. So that was what we saw with definitions. And then in our third class, we discussed discourses. Yeah, discourses. So let me see where we have that. We have discourses here. Types of discourses. We said the discourse is also a passage, and that there are basically two categories of discourses. We have the argumentative discourses and the non-argumentative ones. We said an argument is a passage containing a conclusion and premise or premises. We'll give an example of argument. We talked about how to identify arguments. Then we went to non-arguments, which are the narratives, instructional passages, and rhetorical polemic or opinion. Of course, we don't need to re-explain narrative because it's just a reports of sequence of events, and then instructional passages are collections of imperatives. The rhetorical polemics are collections of emotive expressions. Now we said that one similarity between rhetorical polemic and argument is that both of them could contain claims. But the claims in argument are supported by premises bearing supporting reasons or information. But the claims in rhetorical polemic are supported by emotive expressions. And then we saw verbal and real disputes. We said verbal disputes are those ones arising out of misunderstanding about meanings, the meaning of concepts, or probably the concepts themselves have not been developed to have good meaning, clear meaning, sorry. But the real disputes are the ones over facts or over values. We saw them, and then that was the end of our discussion of discourses. After discourses, we saw the senses of law, the normative and the empirical. Yeah, so this was our fourth class. We started by revisiting the distinction between facts and values. We said values are about what we should or should not do. Facts are about what is or is not. But we said sometimes we can mistake values for facts. We can see factual statements and we can see value statements and we actually assume they are factual statements. We give an example. We said the president has lifted a lockdown. That's a factual statement. The president has rightly lifted the lockdown. That becomes a value judgment. And then we saw metaphors and proverbs. We said metaphors are sentences that should not be interpreted literally. When you say it's raining cats and dogs, it's not reasonable to interpret it literally because it doesn't rain cats and dogs. Cats and dogs do not fall out of the sky. So it cannot rain cats and dogs. If you interpret the sentence literally, it's not reasonable. So it is only interpreted non-literally. That is, it's raining heavily. But for proverbs, you can interpret them literally, because only a fool tests the depth of a river with two of his feet. The literal interpretation is good and it is true. In addition to the literal interpretation, which is reasonable, you also have a non-literal interpretation, which is also good and is a piece of advice. So the major difference between proverbs and metaphors is that metaphors are not interpreted literally, but you can interpret proverbs literally, and you can also interpret proverbs non-literally. So you have a good literal interpretation for proverbs, and then you have a non-literal interpretation which normally serves as a piece of advice. So those are two major differences between proverbs and metaphors. You can't we don't interpret metaphors literally, but we interpret proverbs literally. In addition, we can also interpret proverbs non-literally, but for metaphors, you only interpret them non-literally. Then we saw meaning defects in language. We saw vagueness, which is that the meaning of something has no clear boundaries of application. We saw ambiguity, which is that something has more than one clear meaning. We saw equivocation, which is to take advantage of ambiguity in a word. And then we saw the senses of law. We were saying that there are 6 senses of law. We saw natural laws, which are the scientific laws. We saw civil laws. We saw cultural norms. We saw customary law. We saw moral law, logical law, mathematical, and divine laws. That was the end of that class. That ended the language section of semester's work. The next class was a class beginning our work on arguments, and that was a class on deductive reasoning. So let's get the deductive reasoning slide. And we see here, we introduced argumentation. And we said deductive reasoning is reasoning in which the relationship between the premises and the conclusion is a logical relationship. And for that reason, it is reasoning that permits only one conclusion. We saw example of deductive argument. We saw reference and attribute classes. That's the two parts of a sentence in an argument. It resembles the two parts of a sentence in a definition. Then we saw the finite and infinite reference classes, and we also saw universal and particular statements. Then we looked at validity, what makes an argument valid. To have a valid argument is either you affirm the antecedent or deny the consequent, or it is a valid hypothetical syllogism, or the fourth valid argument is what? Disjunctive syllogism. So there are 4 valid deductive arguments. Any other thing apart from that is a formal fallacy. So how do we arrive at, how do we affirm the antecedent or deny the antecedent? That's where we started looking into the details. Before we did that, we compared deductive reasoning to inductive reasoning. We saw this inductive argument and we saw how it differs from deductive reasoning. We saw that this argument generates more than one possible conclusion, and that was kind of an eye-opener. From there, we went into the details of deductive reasoning. We saw the hidden conditional if and then, and we said that all arguments have hidden conditionals. When you are working on a deductive argument, the first thing to do is to check all the premises. If you have premise 1 and premise 2, or premise 1, 2, 3, 4, check all the premises. You have to try to convert each of them into a conditional. if you try to do that, you find out that only one premise can be converted into a conditional. All the other premises will not be able to convert into a conditional. So it is that one premise that you could convert into a conditional. That is the premise where you will locate the antecedent and the consequent. So you see this argument here, you see that it is premise one that could convert into a conditional. That is the premise where you get your antecedent and consequent. And then of course you could replace arguments with symbols so that you see arguments more clearly. You can see this is a conditional version of the arguments. So locating your antecedent and consequence is that premise that you can convert into a conditional. If you convert a particular premise into a conditional, that part that starts with if is the antecedent, and then the part that starts with then is the consequent. Even if you don't convert it into a conditional, by looking at it in its categorical form, the first part is simply the antecedent, and then the second part is simply the consequent. Okay, so from there, we said arguments could go in four ways. You either have an argument that affirms the antecedent. Once you've located the antecedent and consequent in the premise that you can convert to a conditional, then that argument can go four ways. Is either the argument affirms the antecedent, or it denies the antecedent, or it affirms the consequence, or it denies the consequence. So these are four ways the argument could go. We saw affirming the antecedent, we saw denying the antecedent, we saw affirming the consequent, we saw denying the consequent. Two of them are valid, two of them are not valid. Affirming the antecedent, denying the consequent are valid. Denying the antecedent and affirming the consequent are not valid. And we said that is the rule for deductive reasoning. You can only affirm the antecedent and deny the consequent in order to reach a valid conclusion. Any other operation would make the argument lose its validity. We gave examples, we used all kinds of examples. We used words, we used symbols, we used graphs, we used boxes, we used diagrams to show how it works. After that, we went to hypothetical syllogism. For hypothetical syllogism, we saw how it works. We said the consequence of any particular premise is the antecedent of the next premise. The consequence of a particular premise will be the antecedent of the next premise. And then what the conclusion does is to assemble or bring together the very first premise, the very first antecedent, and then the very last consequence. That will be the conclusion. So that's how hypothetical argument works. We saw two hypothetical fallacies and how they work, and then we went to disjunctive syllogism. Of course, disjunctive syllogism should also have a fallacy like the other arguments. Every argument has a fallacy, but there's no need to write down, there's no need to teach the fallacy of disjunctive syllogism, because the fallacy is so simple that even babies cannot commit that fallacy. I mean, you say either I became a reverend father or I got married. I got married, so I did not become a reverend father. So even a baby will not say either I became a reverend father or I got married. I got married, so I got married. Or either I became a reverend father or I got married. I became a reverend father, so I became a reverend father. So no one is going to commit that fallacy. So there's no need to teach it. All right. So from there, we saw validity versus soundness. We're asking what makes an argument sound. We saw that for an argument to be sound, it has to be valid and it also has to be true. If it is valid but is not true, then it is just a valid argument. If an argument follows the correct rules for deductive reasoning, but the argument is not true, then the argument is valid but not sound. To be sound, it has to be valid and also true. That rounded up our treatment of deductive arguments. And then we went over to inductive arguments. For inductive arguments, we said it is reasoning in which the relationship between the premises and the conclusion is not logical. It's not a logical relationship. So because of that, inductive argument is an argument that generates more than one possible conclusion. So we said for inductive arguments, the premises provide reason for believing in the likelihood of the conclusion, but the premises don't guarantee the conclusion. So for that reason, inductive arguments are probability arguments. And because they don't depend on rules, it is more difficult to evaluate them. To evaluate them, you have to use a lot of common sense and all kinds of, all kinds of calculations. We distinguish between verifiable and confirmable statements, and we said the verifiable statements are normally premises, the confirmable statements are normally conclusions. Now, so conclusions of inductive arguments are not only called confirmable statements, they are also called hypotheses. They are hypotheses. They are the hypotheses that scientists normally make before they go into investigations. So those investigations will be yielding premises. So that's why inductive reasoning is used in the sciences. You generate a hypothesis, and then you go into experiments to test the hypothesis, and then the experiments will be generating premises. That's how it works. So that's why the conclusions of inductive arguments are not just called confirmable statements, but they are also called hypotheses. And from that point of view, we saw two kinds of inductive arguments. Or first of all, two kinds of hypotheses. You have law-like hypothesis, you have statistical hypothesis, and both of them form the two kinds of inductive arguments. We saw examples of inductive arguments that end with law-like hypothesis, and then we saw kinds of inductive arguments that end with statistical hypothesis, and then we said the ones that end with statistical hypothesis are, a bit more reliable. And then we also saw that in the inductive arguments are kind of extrapolations. They are extrapolations, and we saw various directions of extrapolations. We saw part-whole extrapolations, which consist of generalization and statistical syllogisms. And then we saw analogies, we saw predictions. These are kinds of extrapolations. So the two kinds of inductive arguments, the ones that end with law-like hypothesis as conclusions, we saw them, then we saw the other one. After that, we compared deductive to inductive arguments. We're saying, how do we compare deductive to inductive arguments? We said, well, deductive arguments are accurate at the expense of the inability to provide information. But inductive arguments provide information at the expense of accuracy. So the advantage of one is the disadvantage of the other. Then we have falsifiability and science. We're saying that any statement that attempts to provide empirical information must be falsifiable. Any statement that tries to be 100% accurate cannot provide empirical information. So that was our treatment of inductive reasoning, and then we went over to causal reasoning. Causal reasoning, we said it's a kind of inductive argument. Why is causal reasoning a kind of inductive argument? Because causal reasoning cannot be completely accurate. So causal reasoning cannot be described as a deductive kind of reasoning. So it falls into the inductive category of reasoning. We said it is reasoning from cause to effect and sometimes from effect to cause. We saw different senses of the word cause. We saw proximate cause, we saw contributory cause, we saw necessary cause, sufficient cause, we saw causal agent, we saw probabilistic cause, we saw causal chain, causal web. And from there, we went to discuss the three patterns of informal causal reasoning. Of course, we selected them out of 5, which John Stuart Mill had proposed in his book. The first one, we saw relevant difference. Relevant difference is to try to find out a difference in the environment, a new difference, to see if that difference explains a new problem. So if you spot a new problem in an environment, you first of all ask yourself, what has started happening differently in this environment? Probably that is what will explain the new problem. So you identify a new problem, you identify the cause of a new problem in an environment by trying to find out what is happening differently in the environment. And then you have common thread, which is to identify what is common to all the cases of a particular problem. You know. Then you have concomitant variation, which is to measure the intensity or degree of something in the environment that is always in the environment. There are many things in the environment that are always in the environment. You can never eliminate them, but they can also cause problems if they are in the environment and they are occurring at a degree or intensity that is not healthy. You know. You identify such causes with concomitant variation. You know. And from there, we went to study the causal fallacies. These are instances of bad reasoning, how we shouldn't identify causes. The first one, of course, which we commit a lot in Africa, is post hoc ego propter hoc. You know, you visit a fetish doctor before something, and maybe after visiting a fetish doctor, you think that all the good things that have been happening to you are from that visit. You know, okay, so this is the fallacy of inferring causality from chronology. That is the fallacy of thinking that just because A occurred before B means that A must have caused B. You know, but the point is that it doesn't always follow that when something happens before the other, it must have caused it. Then we have non-causal pro-causal, exchanging cause for effect. If A caused B, and then you say that it is B that caused A, then you have committed non-causal pro-causal. Then we have oversimplified cause when there are more than one causes or when there are many causes, and you identify less than the number of causes that actually caused something, then it is oversimplified cause. False common thread is to find a common thread that is not actually there. You know, if you think that all the bright guys in your class have cars, therefore you should get a car in order to be academically bright, that's a false common thread. And then we have confusing correlation with causation. We're saying that correlation is not always causation. You know, it is not every time, it is not always the case that because two things always happen together, then one of them must be causing the other. You know. Then we have slippery slope when you argue that if something happens, then it will lead to something more serious, and that other more serious thing will lead to something that is even more serious, and they will continue to, give birth to more serious consequences. And the order of seriousness will continue to increase without any justification. So that's slippery slope. And I think that ended class for that class, and then even for the end of the semester, no, not for the end of the semester, we still went from causal reasoning. We did informal fallacies, went to informal fallacies. So by the time we came to informal fallacies, we'd seen a lot of fallacies already. We saw fallacies of meaning, we saw formal fallacies, we saw causal fallacies. So we just came here to treat some extra fallacies. Although I told you that there are 38 very solid fallacies, interesting fallacies you need to see. If you don't see them, then you missed something huge. These ones we selected for this semester are just the simplest ones that children should learn and be aware of them. So we already saw equivocation, but this one is equivocation in argument. The time we treated equivocation in meaning, it was equivocation in casual statements. But in this class, we saw equivocation in an argument. Someone saying that women are free from gender inequality because they are free to leave the house and go wherever they want. We said it is equivocation. This is argumentative equivocation. We saw secularity in argument. This is argumentative secularity, repeating the conclusion as a premise. The other secularity we saw in definition was to repeat definiendum as definiens, but this one is to repeat conclusion as premise. Then we saw grandstanding, appealing to majority. We said it is wrong. We saw ad hominem, which is probably the most common fallacy committed in the world. People insulting people instead of addressing their arguments. I like to point out this fallacy a lot in Facebook discussions, or even social media. I don't have a lot of time, but there are sometimes maybe I'm taking a walk, if I'm taking a walk around the neighborhood just to exercise my body, I could decide to look at the social media and see what is being discussed. Sometimes I see ad hominems, I say, oh, this is an ad hominem, and I'll explain it. And then the person will be surprised and humbled. So this is probably the most common fallacy committed on social media. Praising people or attacking people instead of addressing their arguments. We have positive and negative. We have the positive one, praising someone, accepting someone's conclusion by praising the person, and then the negative one is to reject someone's conclusion by attacking the person. Okay. And then we have illegitimate appeal to authority, appealing to authority instead of appealing to facts or arguments or points. When we have the genetic fallacy, this is a fallacy of saying that something is right or wrong depending on where it came from. And then we have what? We have the appeal to threat, which is to tell people that if they don't accept your argument, something will happen to them. We have appeal to pity, which is to whip up sentiments. And then we have three fallacies of manipulating the data. We have the fallacy of misplaced vividness, where someone says, oh, Northerners are being marginalized in this country. And you say, oh, no, it is not true that Northerners are being marginalized. After all, John Mahama was the president. Therefore, Northerners are not being marginalized. That's a fallacy of misplaced vividness. Although I'm not a Ghanaian anyway. All right, so then you have the fallacy of semi-attached figures. This is deceitful use of statistics, where you use statistics that don't fit properly to a conclusion to try to defend the conclusion. And then you have hasty generalization, which is to judge an entire population based on a few samples in a population. So I think that was the end of the class and even the semester. So at this point, I'm going to have to take questions. If you want to ask a question, you raise your hand. We address your question. After that, I'm going to upload this video to your Sakai so that those who couldn't make it to this class will start watching. Even you who attended classes, you can still watch the videos of the classes you attended. It's good to watch videos repeatedly so that at least it's better than reading. It's more enjoyable than having to read a text, That, of course, doesn't mean you shouldn't read, but I think you should combine both in a way that will give you maximum performance. Augustine.
Good morning, sir.
Yeah.
Please, what type of statement is a cultural norm? Is it an empirical or nominative statement?
A cultural.
Cultural norm cannot be.
Which type of statement?
Cultural norm is a belief. A belief about how something should be done or should not be done.
Okay.
A norm is an understanding about how we should or should do a specific thing, or how we should conduct ourselves in a particular way or not. something like that.
Okay.
Yeah, so prepare for your IA on Monday. And after the IA, I could consider giving a second chance to all those who say they had technical difficulties in their various assessments. Remember to do your assessments between 12 and 2 a.m. And remember that if you were given a second chance and you still had problems, then by then the game is over for you. You know, you just have to lose those marks. Basma.
Sir, please, has the assignment one been graded?
No, it's still being graded. So you don't expect any marks there until the end of teaching. You know.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
Hello, sir, please. So you said the IA is on Monday.
Yeah, it's on Monday.
Yeah, you can ask me.
Yeah, so I'm going to have to end the class and then upload the video to your Sakai. Adina.
Hey, please, how do we get the handout of your book?
Handout.
Yes, please.
By handout, you mean the slides or the book? Are you talking about the slides?
Yeah, I want the handout, like the hard copy as well.
Yeah, the hard copy, you have to go to the Department of Philosophy, opposite Legon Main Hall. Yeah, so it's opposite Legon Main Hall. You know Legon Main Hall. So you cross
Yes,
the road
please.
in front of Legon Main Hall, and that's the philosophy department.
Okay.
Go with about 35 CDs or something.
Okay. Thank you, sir.
You're welcome.
Sir. Hello, sir. Hello.
Yes, Augustine, you want to ask?
Yeah, sir, please. Which topics will the IA cover?
That the IA will cover especially those topics you didn't see in your first two assignments.
Okay. So it means inductive reasoning is going to come. And then the casual reasoning.
Yeah, and remember it carries 30 points. So that's quite a hefty part of your overall scores.
Okay, sir. Thank you.
You're welcome. So since this is the...
Sir.
Yes, go ahead.
Please, I want to ask, how many trials you have to attempt the IA?
Yeah, it will be two.
Okay, sir.
2 trials. So if the first trial doesn't work, then abandon the second trial until you have better internet, or you wait for the proper time to take the best time to take it.
Thank you, sir.
You're welcome. Yeah, so we're about ending the class. Since this is our last class, I would want to encourage you to work very hard so that you become great people. And apart from working hard, remember to obey moral principles. Now, a lazy person who obeys moral principles can become more successful than a hardworking person who is not obeying moral principles. Please take that very seriously because it is true. So work hard and obey all moral principles. The consequences of not obeying a moral principle is to cost you a lot of effort, to waste a lot of your energy and all those things. So obeying moral principles is a way of protecting your hard work. So these are lessons you should take into the future as you are getting older. Work very hard, obey all moral principles so that you be great people and responsible citizens, and you can contribute very significantly to your country and continent. So, all right, so we hope to be crossing paths in the future. Until then, right now it is goodbye.
Bye.
God bless you.
Amen.
Au revoir.